Guten Tag. I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. You know, at this point, pretty much nothing surprises me when it comes to the overly curious government entity known as the National Security Agency. But I guess I still thought that you're at least protected from NSA snoops if you want to play offline solitaire in the privacy of your own home. Whoops, guess not. See, according to a New York Times report, the agency has planted software in almost 100,000 computers around the world that don't have to be connected to the internet for the NSA to use them. See, it works through something called radio frequency technology, which allows the NSA to use a covert radio channel to access the microchips in the machines and deliver the data to a listening post up to 8 miles away. But don't worry, according to the NSA, the only computers that are compromised are those of enemy targets. But in a world where everyone's presumed guilty before proven innocent, aren't we all considered enemies now? Let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire with tone. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set.
With the U.S. sitting just behind China, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia in the number of state-sponsored executions, death penalty opponents have plenty of motivation to end capital punishment in this country. And while many of these prisoners are indeed guilty of heinous crimes, consider this. Since 1989, 312 people have been exonerated by DNA evidence alone. And of those prisoners, 18 were facing death sentences. Of course, hundreds, if not thousands, of convicted prisoners have no access to DNA evidence, virtually ensuring that they will never be able to prove their innocence. Which is why the decades-old case of 14-year-old George Stinney is so important. In 1944, Stinney became the youngest American citizen to be executed in the 20th century for killing 2 white girls in South Carolina. This being the Jim Crow-era South, the justice system completely failed Stinney the moment he told officers that he had talked to the girls on the day of their deaths. Without his parents or a lawyer present, Stinney was taken into a room, interrogated, and according to police, confessed to the crime within an hour. However, no written confession exists, and reports at the time say that the officers offered Stinney ice cream in exchange for the confession. The subsequent trial was similarly a complete farce. Stinney was represented by a tax commissioner named Charles Plowden, who, according to Mark Jones, an author who has written extensively about the case, had political aspirations and didn't want to anger the local whites if he ran for office. During the trial, Plowden not only refused to cross-examine any of the witnesses, but he also didn't bring anyone to testify on Stinney's behalf. The trial was over in 2 hours, and it took only 10 minutes for the jury to deliberate and sentence the 14-year-old to die. Fast forward to today, where a group of lawyers are trying to clear his name and force the state of South Carolina to admit this grave injustice. Attorneys Steve McKenzie, Sean Kent, George Frierson, and Ray Chandler have successfully won the right to the appeals hearing on January 21st. And thanks to that publicity that the case has generated, several new witnesses, including the man who originally found the bodies of the 2 girls, have now come forward to offer their testimony. So a big shout out to McKenzie, Kent, Frierson, and Chandler for having the courage and determination to not let a 70-year-old atrocity be swept under the rug. But of course, for every person trying to create a more just society in this country, there are those who want nothing more than a return to the Middle Ages. In particular, a Wyoming state senator who just introduced a bill that would bring back firing squads for state executions because of the money it would save the state. No, this is not an Onion article. Let me repeat that. Firing squads. Republican State Senator Bruce Burns told the Associated Press that he introduced the bill because lethal injection drugs are becoming harder and harder to come by. But in case you were wondering why he didn't want to bring back the gas chamber instead, don't worry, he's got that answer covered. saying, quote, "The state of Wyoming doesn't have a gas chamber currently, so the procedure and expense to build one would be impractical to me. I consider, frankly, the gas chamber to be cruel and unusual, so I went with firing squads because they also have them in Utah." Whoa, whoa. I'm not sure which part of that statement is more shocking. They actually took the time to consider gas chamber execution, or that Utah still allows inmates to choose firing squads when facing execution. In fact, as recent as 2010, death row inmate Ronnie Lee Gardner was executed in just this manner. Now, Utah did ban the practice in 2004, but it was not retroactively applied, hopefully meaning that Gardner will be the last person to die at the hands in this brutal manner. So, thanks to State Senator Bruce Burns for making a complete mockery of the justice system and introducing medieval legislation in the name of fiscal responsibility. Isn't it reassuring to know that legislators aren't wasting their time addressing this country's addiction to capital punishment, but instead are focusing their efforts on how to kill people more efficiently? The end of the internet as we know it. That's what some tech writers are calling yesterday's decision by the D.C. Court of Appeals in the case Verizon versus the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. The court's decision to end what is commonly known as net neutrality abolishes FCC regulations over internet giants like Verizon and Comcast. The ruling came as a huge blow for advocates of a free and open internet. See, net neutrality proponents believe internet service providers will be able to manipulate broadband speeds based on which sites pony up the most cash. So to discuss what this ruling means for the general public and if the free internet that we've come to love is truly dead for good, I'm joined now by Matt Wood, Policy Director at Free Press. Thanks so much for coming on, Matt.
Sure. Great to have you. Great to be here.
So can you explain what exactly the FCC regulations that were just lifted with this new ruling?
The FCC regulations were designed to prevent exactly that. Certain websites being blocked, some of them being sped up, you having to pay more to get to certain sites, like RT is suddenly more expensive to reach than CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. Court struck those down, and we don't think it's dead for good. Sounds a little bit like bringing something back to life, right? The FCC has a chance. They have a chance to fix this, but it's going to be politically difficult, and we are trying to do everything we can to get them to do that.
You know, clearly ISPs have a lot to gain with this recent ruling. How much do they have to influence the ruling?
They have spent a ton of time and money both on Capitol Hill and in these legal challenges, and at the FCC as well, seeking less and less rules, fewer and fewer protections for internet users. They say, trust us, we won't actually do that stuff. We won't block anybody. We won't really try to speed anybody up, but they're starting to try to find ways to get more money out of the internet for themselves and their shareholders, and trying to make sure you and I have less freedom online.
You know, that brings me to this article that I just read for ZDNet. Larry Seltzer, a tech writer, writes, the FCC acted illegally when they imposed anti-discrimination rules on broadband internet service providers. In doing so, they've struck down the open internet rules, which were an attempt to solve a problem that doesn't exist, rampant discrimination by ISPs against various forms of content. Matt, how do you respond to that claim that content discrimination is never a problem? You just mentioned that they promised that it won't be in the future, but has it ever been?
Well, sure, it has been, and they're trying to turn up the temperature ever so slightly and slowly boil the frog. You know, they've tried to be on their best behavior in some ways and not do the most flagrant things like blocking websites, although that has happened across the border in Canada. A big ISP blocked its union's website when it didn't like the fact that they were striking. In this country, we've seen AT&T either block or make you pay more to use something like a video chat application like Apple's FaceTime. Just because they have a legacy business. They say, we like it when you pay us for voice minutes. Maybe we don't like it so much when you use a free and better alternative. So has it been rampant? Not necessarily, but that's because we've had these rules in place and the FCC is looking to make them last. Unfortunately, there's this temporary hiccup, and they're not in place right now, but we're hoping to get them back in place before we see the internet change for good.
Absolutely. Let's talk specifically about how this will affect regular users, other than the fact that you just mentioned it might be more pricey. I mean, will it throttle the traffic, be slower, anything like that?
It could, yeah. I mean, that's the fear, is that once they make more money by selling you priority rather than just giving you access where you want to go and when you want to get there, then they have every incentive not to build out. You know, they monetize that scarcity. They say, oh, we have a fast lane, so sorry your service is slow. If you pay up a little extra, or if you pay an extra $5 a month, you'll get faster access, and that's exactly wrong for the internet. Up till now, it's been a pretty level playing field, and we're afraid this could change that unless the FCC fixes it really soon.
What do you say to those who say this is a free market issue? The government should not be involved with regulating the internet.
Well, how many broadband providers do we have? The government has already been involved in giving those companies rights of way to build their systems, and we don't have many choices for these critical infrastructure utilities, really, is what they are. So it's a free market issue for the services that ride on top of it. You know, there's lots of competition among websites and among apps. There's very little for broadband providers, and so if they say we're going to block you and then you can maybe switch to somebody else, a lot of people can't make that choice. Plus, it's not really like we would allow this in other settings. You know, think of your phone. Just because you have a wireless phone option, you wouldn't say, well, it's okay if AT&T blocks my calls to certain numbers. I can always switch to Verizon.
Pay more.
I can always switch to another carrier. We think that was crazy because the communications network is supposed to be open to you and me to decide where we want to go and how we want to use it. And this ruling threatens that because of these technicalities the FCC has gotten wrong for the last decade.
I really like that analogy. It makes it very clear about why this is so wrong, Matt. And really quickly, I think for people who totally do not trust the FCC, because like every other oversight committee,
right,
they've kind of messed up. I mean, why should we trust them to really set this in stone the way it needs to be?
Well, they have to get it right, but the balance here is we don't want to trust the government completely, and we also don't want to trust the corporations completely, because so often, especially at places like the FCC or Congress, the corporations have all too loud a voice and an outsized say in what those entities do, what those agencies do. So it's not about the government controlling the internet or regulating what we say online. It's about making sure that nobody, neither the government nor the internet service provider, can censor speech or decide what we can reach when we go onto our internet connection.
Keeping it in the hands of the people just as it should be. You said that it wasn't dead as we know it. How can we resurrect it, Matt?
Well, there's technicality here. The FCC made this mistake. They said, we're going to not treat broadband like a communication service. We'll kind of think of it as something like an internet site, and they really confused the two sides. What we want the FCC to do is treat content as it should be, leave it unregulated online, but get back to protecting people when they try to get on the network in the first place. And if the FCC can reclassify, as we say, down in the weeds here in DC, and if they can make the broadband network act like a communications network again, then they can restore a lot of this authority and get back to making sure people have internet freedom, not censorship handed down by Verizon and people who want to edit the internet for their own devices.
And going back to the FCC, you know, kind of the inability to trust them and actually doing this, is there anything that we can do, any tools that Free Press offers that the people can take to really take
freepress.net, we have an action up and an email that we've sent out to more than 200,000 of our members, and people responding quickly and saying, yes, we think the FCC should do this and basically clean up its own mistake here and clean up its own mess. There might be fights on Capitol Hill where we'll have to activate people to call their members of Congress. There might be fights in the court. Lots of different things to come, all sort of still breaking as this decision just came down yesterday, but definitely www.freepress.net and lots of other great sites where you can tell the FCC, clean this up and make sure that we're protected when we get onto the internet and we're not just at the mercy of some corporation.
And we have about 30 seconds left, but what can we expect right now? I mean, are we going to see them kind of taking charge of this and really seizing the power, or what has to happen next?
I think they want to keep their options open for now. It's a new chairman, Mr. Wheeler, who is a distinguished career in the industry, and now he's in the public service, and we hope that he'll do the right thing. We have some indications that he will, but there's a lot of decisions on his plate right now. And basically all they've said so far is we will act to protect the internet. We're not sure yet if that means they'll do everything we think they need to do to get this right.
Tough decisions indeed, important decisions. Thank you so much for staying on top of it. Matt Wood, Policy Director, Free Press. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Coming up, you guys, I'll tackle the corporate media's newest distraction, Biebergate.
We welcome Aaron Aid and Abby Martin, two of the terrific hosts on the RT network.
Boom Bust, it's going to give you a different perspective.
Give me one stock tip.
Oh, never. I'll give you the information, you make the decision.
Tell me about how breaking the set works.
It's a revolution of the mind, it's a revolution of ideas and consciousness.
Are you frustrated with the system?
Yeah, extremely.
Your politics would be described as angry.
I think I'm a strong female.
Are you single?
5 seconds. And over the mic is all fueling go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track Alpha. Roll Alpha.
In fact, the single biggest threat facing our nation today is the corporate takeover of our government and our press.
Stand by, camera 1.
We've been hijacked by a handful of powerful transnational corporations that will profit by destroying what our founding fathers once built up. I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show, we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem. We try to fix it. Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera. Go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture.
You guys, there's so much going on in the world right now, it's hard to even know where to start. Net neutrality might be dead, Andy Kaufman might be alive, and scientists are now one step closer to using the sun's energy at night. But out of all this madness, the media has had a singular focus over the last 24 hours.
Whether it's a young man with too much money and too much time, or a pop prince looking for street cred, or all of the above, Justin Bieber has found himself in trouble yet again.
It all started when Bieber was accused of egging his neighbor's house on Thursday.
An egg at somebody's house is not great. However, we should point out Justin has been a problem neighbor.
There's a history,
for
right?
some time. He's been driving his car fast through the neighborhood. He's had a couple of run-ins with the neighbors.
Yes, the corporate press seems to have come down with Bieber fever. And really, can you blame him? I mean, just look at that face. Because, of course, in a country where talentless musicians are treated like gods, it's easy to sidestep the issues that actually matter. Like, for example, the fact that yesterday, at the same time helicopters were circling Bieber's mansion, the family of Kelly Thomas was grieving over one of the biggest injustices in recent history: their son's murderers getting off scot-free. Or the fact that a group of 59 senators are currently pushing to derail the peace process between Washington and Tehran. In case you forgot, for the first time in over 35 years, the presidents of both Iran and the U.S. are on speaking terms, and they're in the process of negotiating a historic agreement. Under one condition, though: the U.S. will lift the harsh economic sanctions that have isolated Iran for years, and in return, Iran will stop its high-level enrichment of uranium and be more transparent in its nuclear ambitions. But ain't nobody got time for peace. Especially Senators Robert Menendez and Mark Kirk of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who are sponsoring a bill seeking to add a fresh new round of crippling sanctions. Menendez calls it an insurance policy. In an op-ed he wrote for the Washington Post, he describes the bill as a necessary contingency in case the negotiations fail. Does anyone else notice how illogical this is? Unless, of course, Menendez means an insurance policy for failure. Lest we forget that sanctions don't work and have time and again proven to not only not hurt the regime, but hurt the people instead. But you wouldn't know any of this if you were watching the corporate media, because they've had Justin Bieber music videos on loop for the last 24 hours. And you know it's bad when even TMZ is backpaging the Bieber egg scandal to cover real news about U.S. foreign policy. Not just covering it, but breaking it. Yes, you heard me right. Just this morning, TMZ broke open another huge scandal involving U.S. troops obsessed with desecrating dead bodies. Now, I must warn you, the following images are disturbing. TMZ only published a handful of the 41 images they were given, citing that the rest were simply too graphic. As you can see, they depict U.S. Marines burning the bodies of dead Iraqis, seemingly in the backyard of average homes in the city of Fallujah in 2004. Others show Marines posing with human remains or rifling through the pockets of the dead. Colonel Steve Warren, director of press operations for the Department of Defense, told TMZ that, quote, "The pictures appear to show U.S. soldiers in violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which makes it a crime to mishandle remains." Not only is this completely criminal and despicable, it's symbolic of the true legacy of the U.S.'s brutal decade-long occupation of the country. But don't hold your breath on these soldiers being held accountable. After all, the soldiers who were found guilty of urinating on Afghan corpses and trophy photographs walked away with nothing more than a mark on their record, meaning absolutely nothing. No jail, no discharge. But I guess Bieber breaking a few eggs is just too important of a story to fit in a segment about war crimes. What a world this is. Professional journalists are the ones covering celebrity gossip, while celebrity gossip sites are the ones doing the muckraking. On the heels of a polar vortex, record-breaking heat waves, and super typhoons, climate change has never been more apparent. Don't believe me? Well, according to a search of peer-reviewed articles on the research database Web of Science, out of 13,950 articles on climate change, only 4 reject the notion. I'm sorry, 24. But there is still a very vocal minority that disagree, who say that not only climate change is not man-made, but they deny that it's happening at all. Unfortunately, that minority opinion is also expressed by powerful corporations and wealthy individuals who have used their influence to stall any progress in curbing global carbon emissions. Because of the inaction to address this serious problem, many climate change scientists are now proposing a drastic solution known as geoengineering, or the altering of the natural world by artificial means. But what hazardous effects could result from the modifying of the laws of nature? And how ethical is it to politicize the environment for profit? To discuss this, I'm joined by Clive Hamilton, public ethics professor at Charles Sturt University and author of the book Earth Masters, The Dawn of the Age of Climate Engineering. Thank you so much for coming on, Clive.
Hi, Abby.
So last time you were on, before we get into anything else, I have to ask you again. I'm not the expert, but you are. Chemtrails. Is there any reason to suspect that the government is sponsoring spraying going on right now? Because I can't tell you how many people reach out to me about this.
Look, I mean, we have to take science seriously. I mean, that's why we're here talking about climate change. And if you talk to any reputable or even disreputable cloud physicist or atmospheric chemist or atmospheric scientist, they'll tell you that there's no evidence whatsoever for this chemtrails conspiracy. There are no articles in the professional journals, there's no peer-reviewed science. It's just a conspiracy theory which has proliferated on the internet, and we shouldn't take it seriously at all.
And let's move on to climate change, because another obviously big issue is deniers.
Yes.
Especially in the wake of the polar vortex. I mean, how do you respond to people saying that is proof that global warming isn't happening?
Well, I mean, look, we have to listen to the scientists. These are the people who are experts, and yet you have politicians, senators on the Hill who suddenly become, have PhDs in atmospheric physics and believe they can reject a vast mountain of scientific evidence and make their own personal judgment. I mean, do they reject quantum gravity because they just don't like it, or it's inconsistent with their ideology? Climate scientists have a good explanation for the polar vortex. Global warming doesn't mean that, every year it's going to go up by ½ degree consistently. It means we're transforming the operation of a very complex atmospheric system. And sometimes we're going to get freak events like the polar vortex, which itself is explained by global warming. Because the Arctic itself is warming up, this vortex of cold air that constantly goes around the Arctic is at times being pushed out. So you get these great waves of frigid air sweeping across the United States. And yet, one snowstorm in Washington for some people is enough to obliterate decades of painstaking scientific work.
According to a recent study at Drexel University, 75% of all funding behind climate change denial is actually unaccounted for. Like, we cannot trace where this is coming from. How are we supposed to fight back against the propaganda if we don't even know where it's coming from, Clive?
Well, we don't know specifically where it's coming from, but we do know there's a huge amount of dark money that has been channeled through obscure sources and then being fed into the conservative think tanks here in Washington and elsewhere in order to try to undermine the legitimacy and believability of this vast body of evidence on climate science, and also to attack personally and often in very vicious terms the climate scientists themselves. But look, the truth is that this is just like the tobacco company funded campaign against bans on smoking. In fact, it's the same people, often the same think tanks, the same PR people who campaigned against legislation to restrict smoking, who have now shifted over to work for the fossil fuel corporations to try to undermine the credibility of climate science and persuade lawmakers that they should not do what the science says they must do.
I was speaking to Nafiz Ahmed. He's a Guardian journalist who writes extensively about climate change, and he was saying, people like Al Gore, other prominent politicians who are pushing a lot of the global warming rhetoric, also are kind of pushing for money-making schemes as a solution. The carbon credit, he says, is just kind of a money-making scheme. Do you think that that's a responsible way to fight climate change, is the carbon credits?
Well, look, climate change is the ultimate collective problem, and asking individuals or calling on companies to, get behind it in itself is not going to solve it. I mean, we have to sharply reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which means that we have to sharply reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. End of story. How do we reduce consumption of fossil fuels? We need national policies that basically make fossil fuels more expensive than the alternatives, the renewable energy, the energy efficiency. And so we must have some kind of price on carbon, whether that takes a form of a carbon tax or whether it takes the form of an emissions trading system. In a sense, it doesn't matter as long as we impose a cost on polluting the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. That's the fundamental thing on which 99.9% of economists will agree.
Sure, but I think consumers are looking at it and saying, why is the burden pushed on me when you have, giant meatpacking industry who have 20% methane emissions that are heavily contributing?
Well, in the end, the beef producers are like coal-fired power plants. They're responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, but just as you eat beef when you go and buy a hamburger, you consume fossil fuels when you turn a switch on in your home, and in the end, we have got to pay more for using fossil fuels in our homes, our businesses, in our offices. That's just the bottom line. I mean, if people are making a lot of money out of it illegitimately, then we need other policies to work on that. But in the end, we have to pay more for our pollution, and that will encourage us to use less polluting forms of energy and less polluting forms of food.
I agree with you, and I also just think that corporate America and also, world government should really take the lead, and then, hopefully it'll influence the people to follow. Let's talk about the solutions here. Is geoengineering ethical?
Well,
it's a big question.
It depends on what you mean by geoengineering. The prominent scheme, one attracting most attention and most research, is called sulfate aerosol spraying. And the idea is to coat the Earth in the upper atmosphere with a layer of so-called sulfate aerosols, tiny particles. And it's kind of a layer of pollution which dims the Earth, reduces the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth, and thereby cools it. Now, a lot of people would say there's something fundamentally wrong in installing a kind of solar shield that will allow somebody somewhere to have their hand on the global thermostat to reduce the temperature of the Earth and therefore affect the entire climate of the Earth. So there are definitely profound problems, particularly if you have one country, the United States, or China, which is starting to invest in geoengineering, or Russia, which is pushing quite hard for work on geoengineering and getting international acceptability. If you have one nation starting to control the climate system of planet Earth, then you really do have a profoundly unethical situation, which is why many nations of the South, many poor nations, are starting to say, hey, we're worried about this, we want to have a say in what's going on.
That is a really interesting question indeed. I never even thought about that. World governments actually having more control over the other of the actual world's temperature and environment. Thank you so much, Clive Hamilton, for breaking down some of the misconceptions about geoengineering. Professor of Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks for watching, you guys. Join me again tomorrow when I break the set all over again. Guten Tag. I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. At this point, pretty much nothing surprises me when it comes to the overly curious government entity known as the National Security Agency. But I guess I still thought that you're at least protected from NSA snoops if you want to play offline solitaire in the privacy of your own home. Whoops, guess not. See, according to a New York Times report, the agency has planted software in almost 100,000 computers around the world that don't have to be connected to the internet for the NSA to use them. See, it works through something called radio frequency technology, which allows the NSA to use a covert radio channel to access the microchips in the machines and deliver the data to a listening post up to 8 miles away. But don't worry, according to the NSA, the only computers that are compromised are those of enemy targets. But in a world where everyone's presumed guilty before proven innocent, aren't we all considered enemies now? Let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this. on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire with tone. These words are hard hitting. Watching
minutes for the jury to deliberate and sentence the 14-year-old to die. Fast forward to today, where a group of lawyers are trying to clear his name and force the state of South Carolina to admit this grave injustice. Attorneys Steve McKenzie, Sean Kent, George Frierson, and Ray Chandler have successfully won the right to the appeals hearing on January 21st. And thanks to that publicity that the case has generated, several new witnesses, including the man who originally found the bodies of the two girls, have now come forward to offer their testimony. So a big shout out to McKenzie, Kent, Frierson, and Chandler for having the courage and determination to not let a 70-year-old atrocity be swept under the rug. But of course, for every person trying to create a more just society in this country, there are those who want nothing more than a return to the Middle Ages. In particular, a Wyoming state senator who just introduced with the U.S. sitting just behind China, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia in the number of state-sponsored executions, death penalty opponents have plenty of motivation to end capital punishment in this country. And while many of these prisoners are indeed guilty of heinous crimes, consider this. Since 1989, 312 people have been exonerated by DNA evidence alone. And of those prisoners, 18 were facing death sentences. Of course, hundreds, if not thousands, of convicted prisoners have no access to DNA evidence, virtually ensuring that they will never be able to prove their innocence. Which is why the decades-old case of 14-year-old George Stinney is so important. In 1944, Stinney became the youngest American citizen to be executed in the 20th century for killing two white girls in South Carolina. This being the Jim Crow-era South, the justice system completely failed Stinney the moment he told officers that he had talked to the girls on the day of their deaths. Without his parents or a lawyer present, Stinney was taken into a room, interrogated, and according to police, confessed to the crime within an hour. However, no written confession exists, and reports at the time say that the officers offered Stinney ice cream in exchange for the confession. The subsequent trial was similarly a complete farce. Stinney was represented by a tax commissioner named Charles Plowden, who, according to Mark Jones, an author who has written extensively about the case, had political aspirations and didn't want to anger the local whites if he ran for office. During the trial, Plowden not only refused to cross-examine any of the witnesses, but he also didn't bring anyone to testify on Stinney's behalf. The trial was over in 2 hours, and it took only 10